Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jennifer Creamer, and I'm the Executive Director for the Center for Global Engagement here at Robert Morris University. I'm happy to welcome our in-person and virtual guests to today's lecture, Localization, Games, and Authenticity, Perceptions from the Localizers, by Dr. Marina Fontalan, the Robert Morris University Rooney Visiting Scholar for Spring 2022. The Rooney Visiting Scholar Program was established through the generosity of the Rooney family in 2004, with the purpose of enhancing the richness and diversity of teaching and scholarship at RMU by inviting international scholars to serve as visiting faculty members and be in residence on campus. This spring, our Rooney Scholar is being co-hosted by the School of Engineering, Math, and Science and the School of Informatics, Humanities, and Social Sciences. And I'd like to thank Deans Kalovich and Ali for their gracious hosting. Dr. Marina Fontalan is an experienced historian and science and technology studies scholar at the University of Campinas in Brazil. Dr. Fontalan received her PhD in science and technology studies from the same university and holds further certifications in history as well. Her primary research subject is on the sociological aspects of video game localization, and she has written several articles on games and its historical representations and games and violence. And for any faculty or staff here who would like to invite Dr. Fontalan to speak in your class, please feel free to contact me. And for students here today, we'll send out a link if you are interested in receiving set credit for attending this event. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Marina Fontalan.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. I would like to start this lecture by thanking RMU for sponsoring my visit here. Being a Rooney Scholar has been a great experience for me. And I also would like to thank the University of Campinas, Unicamp, for all its help for me to become a doctor. Also, I would like to thank CAPES for the grant they provided me during my PhD, in which part of the lecture that I'm going to give is actually part of my dissertation too, and also the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, in which I served as a visiting scholar also while I was a PhD candidate. So, let's see, okay. So when we start to study a little bit about video game localization, it's very common for us to read in the literature that the game localization experts, also known as localizers, they do face a very specific challenge, which would be how to translate a game and provide an authentic experience to players regardless of the language that they decided to play a game. Which actually gave me, it sparked me a question. Do these professionals, these experts, actually deal with authenticity problems? And if so, how do they deal with that? So this presentation examines how localization experts discuss what authenticity is and the different aspects each has when they're localizing a game, which include art changes and also some changes, some cultural references. So for that, I'm going to bring some definitions. So what is culture, what is video game, what are video games, what is localization, and also what I'm considering authenticity here. After that, I'm going to tackle some of the methodology that I used for this research, and also from that, the themes that the data gathered allowed me to talk about. So, which are the game changes that they provide, that localization process due to the games. Also, how they deal with like different and specific game themes, and also some final thoughts and in which I talk about how they actually define authenticity. Okay, so let's start with the major theme of this talk, which is actually a video game. So a video game is a multimedia interactive form of entertainment for one or more individuals, powered by a computer hardware and software controlled by the peripheral. And this peripheral can be anything, and it can be like a console controller, the mouse from your computer, or even your body if you are considering like virtual reality sets and or also controllers such as Kinect. They are displayed in some kind of a screen, and this screen can be as big as an iMac screen, or it can be as small as our smartphones on our pockets. It doesn't matter. They can be used as an entertainment or parts of a serious educational training program. Thematically, they can portray any topic, activity, or parallel universe in which the human imagination is able to conjure up. So this is what I'm considering video games, and now, of course, for localization. So localization is a process that adapts and translates games. It is more than a word-by-word translation, as it aims to adapting a product to a culture other than the one that created it. So if we get like localization has these besides the translation aspects, of course, I mean changing a game from one language to another, they also have to make sure that people playing the game will understand the game, and one method that they use to make sure that people will understand the game and will have like experiences that would be the same regardless of the language that the players are playing the games, is to change some, for example, cultural references. If you watched my last lecture that I had here, I gave some examples in Brazilian video game history in which they changed characters from a video game to make it more adaptable and like easy to recognize for the Brazilian population, so they would actually buy the game and play them. So just a few more definitions here. So culture, I know that like defining culture, especially for the social sciences, is always it's a very difficult topic because there are like tons and tons of people trying to describe what culture is and also trying to define it, and there is like a huge literature around this theme. However, I try to get this very brief and small definition that can be used in this very specific topic that I'm talking. So, culture is a set of socially constructed behaviors and beliefs that can be tied to different social groups, and it is used by nation states to bring the idea of a unity to the people within their borders. Okay, so culture. Every time that I talk about culture, it will be this very specific definition. And also, and to last, what am I considering authenticity regardless of what my data said? So authenticity is a concept that brings up the idea of something being true and being original. Applied to a localization context, this means that localizers should keep the meanings and values of the original games to the game's localized version. So this is always, this is what the localization scholars talks about being the challenge of localization. So let's talk a little bit about methodology. So for my PhD, I interviewed around 10 localization experts, and only 4 of them will be shown here. One reason for that is that when I talked about authenticity, it actually came to a surprise for most of these localization experts, because the majority of them said that they weren't actually thinking about this when they were localizing a game. So it was a very interesting data that came to me. However, these 4 people, of course, all their names are changed as a way to anonymize them. All these people, they actually sat down and tried to think a little bit about the subject as they were being interviewed. So, and one thing that it's also important to mention is that all these interviews were recorded, and they were all semi-structured. So, like all of them were asked around the same questions, but depending on the outcome, I decided to do some different questions to them. So let's start talking a little bit about this data that I gathered and how I analyzed it. So the data that I gathered allowed me to split the content into 3 main themes. So games, culture, and authenticity, which is the first one that we're going to talk. Then we are going to have game changes and also game themes. So let's start with games, culture, and authenticity. So the first one, which is a challenge for the video game industry in general, is creating games that are capable of being localized. And there are 2 very specific aspects to it. The first one is technical, so like creating a code that will actually be able to read different sets of languages, because like each language has its own sets of letters, its own sets of symbols, and its own rhythm. So the code has to be able to read this and actually show on the screen, so the player can actually interact with it. So we have this technological aspect, and also we have a social, let's say it's a social and cultural side to creating a game, which is tied to, of course, the reference that we have, the cultural reference that we have in the games, the stories, the values that the games are putting through. So one example of this is from Hayden. So Hayden is a freelance localization expert from Spain, and this person is specialized on PC games. And this person says the following: cultural elements are always important, but it is important that the player knows and understands what's happening in the game too. I know from other companies that they take a more globalized approach, changing what they understand as non-understandable or troubling issues, characters' names, costumes, and even food. But as related to my work, the game's story is untouchable. Local laws, especially with history issues, have some impact in strategy games, but localizers and translators just follow the company's remarks about them, as they got other legal advisors behind them. So, as far as anybody has ever told us, you can't say that. So this is a very interesting example that shows that games, when they're being localized and to be sold to other countries, they do face a lot of different issues. I mean, like she tells here about legal issues related to some historical events. Germany is a quite known case. They can't have any representations related to Nazism in their games. So every strategy game has to change these sorts of like imaginaries to be sold in Germany. And there are also some, and there are also some other issues. For example, LGBTQ people which are considered illegal. For example, in Russia, so like the games have to also to change any LGBTQA+ representations in their games. So this is also, I'm sorry. Thank you. Thanks. Sorry, everyone. So they do need to change some of their experiences, so these games can be portrayed, can be sold in very specific countries. So now we are going to talk a little bit about user expectation about the game itself. So players are they do hold a very important role in video game localization and video game development. They are usually the ones that require the games to be localized and translated into the languages that it is usually native to them. This is actually a big discussion that I do in another, in a paper that it was accepted to be published, but so let's see after the new reviews comes out. And this discussion is actually very interesting, but also talking about players' expectations and authenticity brings a new aspect to it. So localization is very different for each market. Again, we have to understand that the expectations are in different, what the expectations are in different countries. So another interesting question that comes up a lot when we're talking about culturalization is where to draw the line between adapt your game to local taste. Or do you want to have them to invite us into a culture that they might not be familiar with, or just outside their existing norms? These are all big, difficult decisions. From what I see is that big AAA publishers tend to play safe. And they want to make sure that the content is not offensive to any of the market. So even is the localization manager from a company at the United Kingdom, and as you can see, this person brings some very interesting topics to the table. So first of all, how much to localize to actually make these games and all its cultural references actually known to the countries that they are in, or how to show or how to introduce gamers to a different culture that they're usually not used to or they don't know anything about. So bringing these ideas, so like bringing these to the games also brings to show how complex this discussion about authenticity and games are. So so depending on how much you localize a game and change it to adapt it to local tastes, you are actually changing a lot of the game itself. So playing with also the game's expectations. So the gamers are expecting to play a game that they will understand, they will have fun with. So they will. So trying to cross this line between what is comfortable to the player and what is not is always a challenge for the localization experts. So another thing about Evan's remarks here is that what is a big AAA publisher? So big AAA publishers are those very big names that we have in the video game industry. So Electronic Arts, Rockstar Games, Ubisoft, Nintendo, etc. So these big, so they're big companies that have actually a big budget to create their games, and they're called the AAA publishers. And they tend to play safe in the idea that they tend to create games that won't be offensive to the vast majority of the world. So it's it's something that I've been calling the Disneyification of gaming. So they're trying to create stories that can be told to everyone. So they're like usually as blank like as possible, because it tends to be very difficult to make everyone's happy. So at last, we are going to. There is also these debates on what and how to adapt. That like both our previous examples already talked a lot about. So both Hayden's and Evan's remarks on how much can we actually change the game without it actually becoming its own new thing, and not like, and it still be considered like the same game if you are playing in French, in English, or Spanish. So this is always, there's always this like troubled waters to explore. So, and also Finlay talks a little bit about it, and Finlay is a multi-platform games also from Sweden. So this person tells that now, looking at the broader context, there are also other considerations to take into account for authenticity. Puns, jokes, Easter eggs, etc. That's also a part of a feel of the game, and this has to be adapted to our native players to offer them the same feeling. Just translating is not enough such cases. These would feel off. So those words often need far more work, finding fun, appropriate song, movie, or book to be referenced and give fun to the players in our native language, like it is the case of English speaker players. So I mean, considering that they are a Swedish publisher, their native, the native language for their games is of course Swedish. So they are always adapting these cultural references to their English versions. One example, we are going to see like some examples of that, but if there was a game that featured, for example, the Jim Fallon show, okay? I mean, it's a very known show here in the US. However, it comes from Brazil. I would have no idea who this person is. I have never watched Jim Fallon. I just know this person because I saw like a ride at Universal Studio, and like I know that he exists because of that. Otherwise, so like at least if there is like a game pun or something like that, in this realm for me, it wouldn't, for example, work. And of course, it happens like in a constant. It happens constantly in different games and of course different languages. So now let's head to our second big thing that I managed to take from the data that I gathered, which is all about game changes. So game changes are all the types of changes that we need to do to the game in order for it to be better understood and better and actually better accepted to the people, to the players who are playing them. Okay, so there are two ways that I manage that I discuss these changes, these changes in games. So one we already talked a little bit about. So do we do great changes versus acceptability? So how far should we actually adapt a game to a player, or should we just let some oddities in the game so people can get that game was not created in the country that they're playing on, so it comes from a different culture, and like the shock which actually comes. It would actually make them think a little bit more about the culture that the game was originally from, and kind of learn how to accept these differences. Which actually brings us to the next point, in which big changes in games are actually becoming pretty rare in the video game industry, which is actually part of what I told you about of like this Disneyification of games. So let's take a look at Bailey's interview. So let me just get my code here. So Bailey is a localization manager, also specialized in games for computers, and its base is on Germany. So this is a specific answer when I asked about how much of the games were changed. So no, actually not for our games right now. I don't know if it's the same with other companies. We have never had any specific case where we need to change anything, because I know we published a game and it settled in Edo, Japan. And that's a German company. So that company was in touch with a lot of Japanese, cultural people with cultural background and advisors, So from the start, they made sure that the text is going to be appropriate. So I don't think we ever had, we mostly like fantasy settings, and we don't localize into any region that has problems with like female characters, for example. So here we actually have two different aspects. So one is a choice of like not selling their products in specific countries that will bring them like a lot of trouble, and they have to change everything in the game. And the second one is to actually have consultants, so like they can create a game that should be easily adaptable and easily sellable anywhere. So, but it was not always the case in history. So I always bring this example, which is actually pretty funny. I know it's a 32-year-old game by now, but it's Final Fantasy Legend II for the Game Boy. And one thing that it's very interesting about this game is that during this time, Nintendo United States, they were actually bringing the Japanese games from Nintendo here, and they were translating everything to the American audiences. However, they had a very specific rule that none of the games could talk about drugs. So in this case, they had to change a lot of, they actually had to change a lot. Is it okay if I walk? Just, yeah. Okay? Okay, so let me just come here. Okay, so here the character is actually asked this flower, which is a poppy. So I don't know how many of you know that, but like poppies are the flowers that I use to create opium. So he's actually, the flower is saying that like opium is going around secretly. So that's what is written in Japanese here. But when we get to the American version, they actually changed the opium idea to banana. So you're talking about bananas to a flower, which actually makes things very funny, and it changes the pace of the game a lot. And like these kinds of adaptations were very common during this time, especially here in the US. And another thing that it's very interesting is that each of these characters in Japanese takes 2 bytes of memory to be processed into the game, and like these Western characters just take 1. So what they did is actually they managed to create a more detailed experience to the American audience. So as you can see here, the amount of grass is different. And also they have like an extra flower. So as you can see, this game went through a series ton of changes So it could actually be published and sold here in the US. However, this is a very extreme case, and they don't, and I mean, like, there's still some changes that they do to the games, as I said, like for the Germany with the Nazi, with like Nazist symbols and etc. However, these amount of changes are not common anymore. Okay, so, but even though it's just a fun little example that I really enjoy. So. Now we talk a little bit about game themes. So one thing is to change the game. So the game portrays certain characters, certain themes that cannot be talked or shown in other countries, and you have to change everything. And the other one is then like how to choose the appropriate themes for your game. So. I'm quite like repeating myself here. So like these AAA companies, these very big publishers, they usually create these like very like bland stories for their games, with the sake of like being able to sell them in like as many countries as possible without having to pay like a ton of money for localization efforts. And there is also the indie developers, who are the ones that are pushing actually the envelope in the video game industry, making like representations of Black people, trans people, LGBTQ in general, so like all the other minorities, like having a very good representation within their games. So they are the ones who like explore these areas a lot more, but I mean, as they are indie publishers, they are independent, so they can't. I mean, they usually don't have. They usually don't have like as much success as like a new Mario Brothers game in which he will save Peach again for being like kidnapped by Bowser for like the 30th time. So. They do bring these other ideas to the table, and they are the ones who are pushing things forward. And another idea that people usually use for choosing the game themes is actually using branding and licensing to create like an user expectation and actually bring consumers from other media into video games. So. They can use books, they can use movies, TV series, everything as a theme for their games, with actually various degrees of success. So this is by far the most famous case in which branding and licensing did not match with players' expectations, and therefore it created, in this case, historians of technology usually put this case as like the beginning of a major crash in the video game industry in 1983. So this is the infamous E.T. the Extraterrestrial for Atari 260. So this game, you would play as, of course, E.T. You would be trying to go home. However, the gameplay is very is actually very bad, and therefore, like people didn't buy this, and they weren't like buying already a lot of games anymore because they were getting quite repetitive. And the time they were always exploiting these each new branding license that they could get. And therefore, we had a market crash in '83. And in the case of Atari, what they decided to do is to pull all the copies of the games from the store, and they actually sent it into a landfill in New Mexico. And recently, they actually did a documentary about this situation, and also they dug up the landfill, and they found all the Atari games that were just thrown away. So that's also an issue with like localization and how to bring like players' expectations into of course into play and being able to sell games. So let's go to final thoughts. So we explore, we are able, with this data that I gathered, we are able to explore three main aspects when we're talking about video games, localization, and authenticity. So the first one is related to targeted cultures, games, and their changes during localization process. So how much to localize, how much to change, and also will that like oddity to the like will that nod to another culture be super unacceptable to the players or not? Second one is doing substantial changes in content related to a wider market penetration, which is actually getting, as I said, it is getting very rare, and also brings this idea of like creating Disney-like experiences, which will be bland but very enjoyable to everyone. And third one, how the interviewees perceive this debate during their work. So as I said at the beginning, when I started to talk about authenticity and games with my interviewees, they usually didn't, their major responses were like, we don't actually think about this. It was a little bit odd to them, but then, of course, as you could see here, we continued this conversation for a while, and then they decide, and then they started to actually see how they perceived what authenticity is, which actually brings me to the definitions of what they consider to be an authentic experience to games, and also how localization plays a part on this. So I got two major definitions for that. So the first one is authenticity as a feeling. So player must feel that the game and background stories are real and are enjoyable for them. And authenticity as something that is real and credible. So considering that authenticity is something real, incredible, is not always super compatible to video games, especially because we can, like the vast majority of games are not about the real world, but they are about usually fantasy worlds. So thank you so much, everyone. Hope you have enjoyed, and that's that. Thank you. Okay.
If anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask it. Oh,
yeah.
Oh,
Am I talking?
yeah, you can.
Should I be talking?
Yeah.
So you were talking about localization and how it's being integrated into companies in, it seemed, two ways, where either from the inception of the game, they're working alongside these localization experts to create a game that is widely accessible to multiple regions, and then there's also companies that are creating a game and then making localization efforts to make it compatible after the fact of the game being made. Do you think that one of those methods is superior to another?
They actually began with this idea, like the vast majority of them, they would just like publish the game first and then ask for the localization experts to translate the games and like to start, so then they could start selling in other places. So the case of Nintendo is actually one of the biggest cases here for the US. But like nowadays, what they do is that from the conceptual phases, there are some localization experts involved. So like from the get-go, they know exactly where the games are going to be sold. So they prepare already like the theme who will be localizing. There is no, I don't think there is like a superior method to one or another. One thing that that changes a lot is how many people will actually buy the game from like a pre-purchase opportunity. So like if they see that their language will be featured in the game, they are probably more susceptible to buying the game instead of like having to wait a couple of months. So like they will have like their language in a patch or something. So these can change a lot, which is actually one of the challenges that indie developers make. I mean, they don't have like too much money to put into the games and to the development, so usually localization gets falling behind. So they usually either rely on fans to do it, or some they will have to wait like a couple of years sometimes to be able to create a localized version. So yeah.
All right, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Sushi, probably.
I had a question. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Can you hear me? You're good? Okay, I'll speak loud. So historically, which games have been localized more? What type of games have been localized more?
So could you repeat the question?
Oh, sure. So what types of games historically has been localized more? So educational games first, that's for sure. Because like educational games, they also have to comply to very specific educational standards that changes a lot depending on the country. Then like strategy management games, I have seen those a lot. And also first-person shooters. I think those would be like at least on my, I don't have the numbers, but at least on my perception, those are the most localized, and of course, and then probably the next one would be role-playing games that have like these big worlds and which are full of like lore and etc. So it would be like more required to a player who doesn't speak, for example, English, to be able to understand and play it. So yeah, that would be my bet.
Yeah, I was just gonna ask, like, you said there isn't a word-for-word translation. You have to adapt like different cultures, like it's not like word-for-word. But why is that? What is the significance of not have to change the culture around?
Yeah. So
Could you repeat that too?
oh, sure, of course. So why localization is not just word translation, but also has like all these other like adaptations for. So first of all, it's a question of understanding the game. So as I said, for example, with the Jim Fallon reference, I mean, like I've heard about the guy, but I have never like seen his show before. So like if I'm playing a game that has this, that has a reference to his show, I wouldn't be able to understand it. So it would be, if that was like a fun moment at the game or something like that, it would be completely lost to me, for example. So one of them is understanding. And second one is accepting and creating actually an identity around that game. So when we play games, and actually when we do anything that we do, we shape our identity around it. So when we're cooking, when we are like playing games or reading, etc. So when you have like these very specific cultural references to your own country, you start. It's not super a conscious thing, but you think that that game was actually created for you. I mean, it speaks to you more specifically. So you are able to create a bond. You create like a better bond between you and the game. So that's also why localization cannot be a word-to-word translation. Yeah. You're welcome. I don't know if I answered, but yeah. Other question?
One more question.
Yes, of course, Susha.
So which locals, so let me put it this way, which countries or which locals are more targeted for localization?
Okay, which countries are more targeted to localization? So first, at the beginning of localization history, we did have like a ton of Japanese games brought to the US. However, from there, they several American companies, and I'm thinking like Sierra, Broderbund, and etc. They actually created local, like selling offices in Europe. So therefore, they started to localize their games into European languages. So they created what we call the EFIGS acronym. So it's English, French, Italian, German, and Spanish. From there, with the development of like high-speed internet and the distribution of digital games, some more languages were actually put into play. So like besides like European Spanish, they started to do Latin American Spanish, Brazilian Portuguese, simplified Chinese, and Russian. So these are usually the languages that games are localized into. But I mean, with this amount of languages, just these AAA, very big companies can do, because it can be like an expensive project to do. So, yeah.
I'm just going to ask one more.
Yes, of course.
I'm very so much interested. So I understand that the internet is a big medium to play globally.
Yes.
Now, when I'm more accustomed to localization, am I able to play in the global local?
Okay, yeah. So like playing online, playing on the internet, how to deal with that. So there are two ways that that companies do for that they deal for that. One is like players can choose like the server that they're going to play, and like they can. I mean, they try to interact with each other, usually in English. So like even though. So it can be like a little bit difficult for people who just plays the game in their like native language but doesn't know any other language. It can be a little bit challenging for them. And another, so they can choose to play like in a more like an American. They're like in Spain, but they can play in like an American server or something. Or they can actually choose a Spanish server, for example, if you're like a Spanish player. And there you're going to find like more players who are from the same country. So you're actually going to be able to communicate in your native language. So that's the way like these companies do. I mean, they do create like servers all around the world, and you are the one who are choosing to do one thing or another. I mean, of course, if you go to the esports arena. People would have to learn English because there are like several of these esports teams. They usually have like people from different countries that just go together, just get together for the competition. So this can also happen. Any other questions?
I did have one too.
Yes, of course.
It's so fascinating to hear how they change, the localizers change it. At what point do you localize it so much that the game that's localized is so different from the original game? Because I think about things like intellectual property and how do you say, well, this is my game, but it started out being a game about an opium flower and now it's a banana. Like how does it, at what point do they stop, or is it still the same game?
Yeah, this is the $1 million question actually for them. But like in general, they do have like a point where they have to stop. Otherwise, they're going to like tamper with the story that was originally created for the game. The case that I showed, it's more about, it was like one mission within the entire game that has to be like very much changed to be able to. And it was like a law issue. It wasn't like a question for the players being sensible to drugs or anything like that. So in this case, in this case they changed a lot, but it was like one mission in one game. So it didn't change like the entirety of the experience. So this is something that they're always like debating about, like how much can I change? How much do we present people with like the original material and etc. So that's always the question for them.
Well, again, thank you so much.
Thank
and
you.
thank you in
you
person
all.
and virtual visitors.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.